Okay, so I think we're recording here. Um, what we're looking at today is the funeral customs of the ancient Greeks and the Romans. And there's a lot packed into these early units. And I've always said this about this particular class. As we get further on in history, it becomes easier because it becomes more familiar. When we look at the Greeks and the Romans and the Scandinavians, it's it's not familiar information. When we get to the 19th century, the concepts and the terms we talk about are much more familiar because they're not from the ancient world. So, like I said, if you hate history, we'll get through it. But if you enjoy history, I think it's interesting stuff in this. So, the funeral customs of the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks believed that death was bad, evil, and possibly terrifying. Not possibly, absolutely terrifying to them. By 700 BC, they believed the dead actually had a bodily existence under the earth. Later, this belief gave way to a concept of a shadowy afterlife, where people turned into disembodied souls, which ultimately will lead then to adopting cremation as their primary method of disposition. We'll talk about why here in just a little bit. But the Greeks were, an interesting group of people. They were wildly smart. I mean, so much information, so much knowledge still studied today came out. When you think about, the ancient period and talk about people like Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, there was one ancient Greek guy named Parmenides who, this guy dug a hole in the ground, like 5 or 6 feet, and sat there and watched the sun, like how the sun rays come down on the side of the thing, then got up and walked something like 50 or maybe 100 miles to a fixed point that he knew was 50 or 100 miles away, dug a same hole, and then sat there and watched the lines of the sun again come down. From this information, he was able to calculate how large the Earth was. He was able to figure out how large of a planet the planet was. This is at a time when many people believe the Earth was flat. Although I guess there are some people that believe the Earth is flat now, but the only thing he could not account for was the Earth is a little bit wider in the middle because it's spinning, and that was just outside of his range. But he was very, very close to getting this thing within like 60 miles. Taking that whole spinning out of it. It's fascinating stuff. But when it came to death, they were really, really dark. If you remember, we were talking about Thanatos last week, and again, he was very hateful towards man because the ancient man hated him. He was the Greek god of death, if you recall. So, like I said, they're the first group, and this is sort of not true in that the Scandinavians were doing this prior to the Greeks. However, the Scandinavians were not one large civilization the way the Greeks were. They were, bands of people. So it's not considered as, a whole civilization that adopted it. So they felt that to have a better chance to make it in the afterlife, cremation was better because it would purify your soul. Not everybody is promised a place in the afterlife. In this ancient Greek world, so they felt that okay, if we cremate them, they will be the soul will be purified, and you'll have a better chance of making it into the afterlife. We'll talk about that in a little bit. One interesting point we'll talk about this well later on. They never fully abandoned burial. Burial and handling of remains was important. If you were going to make it in the afterlife, your remains had to be dealt with properly, else you forfeited your chance to make it to the afterlife. So, the cult of Dionysus. In the ancient world, there were all these different cults, mystery cults, what they call them. The cult of Isis, the cult of Osiris, and the cult of Dionysus. The cult of Dionysus was one of the biggest ones out there. Dionysus was the god of wine, and worshippers of his included Spartacus, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, St. Augustine. St. Augustine, who's one of the just bedrocks of Christianity. He really developed many of the concepts we know of in Christianity. Excuse that if you hear my daughter playing in the background, but this was a huge, huge religion. It actually gave Christianity a run for its money in the ancient world. And basically, they had all these rites, and they were intended to produce wild excitement beyond normal senses. And the way that you did this was you went to drink, you got drunk and you went to orgies. It was just a religion of drunken orgies. So you can see why it took off so fast. I mean, join my religion. We're going to go to church on Sunday. Oh, join my religion. We're going to go get drunk and have orgies. And it was this religion was so big that some scholars have argued. I don't know whether it's true or not. I wasn't there. Some scholars have argued that the inclusion of the wedding in the Bible, when Jesus turned water into wine, is intended to be taking a shot at the cult of Dionysus, saying, well, you worship the god of wine, but our God is so powerful, he can actually make your God. So yeah, it's whether, like I said, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But they felt if you were, again, not everybody makes it to heaven, and heaven is the Elysian fields. But if you were the best at drunken orgies, if you were like the top tier and you did everything right, in death there'd be an ecstasy of the soul. Your soul would leave the body and have a union with the god Dionysus. It was one of the reasons that this loses out in the long run is that idea that not everybody makes it to the afterlife, where in Christianity they do. And that was one of the things that you read about St. Augustine. He has all these interesting stories about, he'd be coming out of these drunken orgies, and his mother, who had already converted to Christianity, would be there on her knees praying outside the door for his soul. And like, Mom, what are you doing? But his whole conversion. And at one point he says, oh Lord, come into, at least that's what they say. Oh Lord, come into my life and save me and make me a better person. Just not right now. It's interesting stories. All right, whenever we get to the next page. All right, so again, their view of death was very, very bad. Generally, the Greek did not look forward to a glorious afterlife upon their death. Most were resigned to the fact that they would die. It is what it is. So resignation could be the result of the belief that only a special few were expected to have their soul united with the god Dionysus. The funeral rituals performed by this culture and the attention given to the grave, the memory of the departed played an important role in the way in the way the living related to their dead. It was important. Again, I don't think a lot of people. There's not a lot of people today that believe that if you don't do certain things in the body, you won't make it into the afterlife. Like that has become somewhat irrelevant in the modern era. But during this time, it was very important in most cultures. You had to handle the body correctly, and there was this connection between the living and the dead. We still see this a little bit in, I suppose, Catholicism with purgatory. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But by and large, it tends to be less important these days, but it was very important in this era. So burial practices, reverence to the dead, permeates the burial custom of the Greeks, and it was critical that the dead be given a decent burial. Even after 700 BC, cremated remains were also buried with ritual. The law of Athens required that even bodies of strangers be covered with earth. So even if you're running down the street, or you're running through the woods, let's say, and you come across a body lying there, you should stop and you should bury it. Or if you're being chased, and let's say you're being chased by a lion or something, I don't know if there's lions in ancient Greece, but you're being chased and you see a body lying there, you should at least throw 3 handfuls of dirt onto them, and that will at least secure their place and help them make it into the afterlife. And we still see this in certain cultures, well, not the requirement, but there's still that ceremony. I know that I had certain, I want to say it's the Lutherans, that you have to bring sand to the cemetery because they pour that onto the casket. They've argued that is a continuation of that, or at least a continuation of that custom. The law of Athens required that even bodies of strangers must be covered with earth. Negligence of the dead was condemned. On the battlefields, Athenians would erect pyres and cremate their dead. They would gather the bones and return them to Athens and tomb them with honor. I believe the book talks about there was a Greek general. He goes to war, wins a big war, and neglects to bring back the dead bodies so that they could be buried, or at least bury them and bring the bones back or whatever, bring the bones back at a later point. And because of this, he was put to death. They took this stuff seriously. And in plays, I had to look at some of my notes. My computer's very, very slow. There's a play called Antigone, and in this play, she must sacrifice herself to get dirt strewn on her brother so that he can have a chance to make it into heaven. In the Iliad, Hector prays that his body can be buried so he can make it into an afterlife. It was serious stuff. It was really intertwined with their death beliefs. And they were in a lot of battles. The Greeks were you tend to think of the Greeks, at least I do, of sitting around and thinking about the great, philosophies and developing all this stuff. But there was, the Peloponnesian Wars, the Trojan Wars. There was a bunch of others that I'm blanking on, but there were a ton of wars that they were in. So preparation of the dead. Family and possibly children would be the ones to initially care for the dead. And we'll see this throughout history. Females tend to be the ones that are expected to care for the dead. We see this all the way up until funeral homes are developed in the late 1900s. And at that point, women sort of get pushed out of the industry for a couple of years, a couple of decades, I should say. But all the way through history, it was always looked at as a woman's work, a quote unquote woman's work, caring for the home, raising the children, caring for the dead. That was always considered a female's job. So they would close the eyes and mouth. Family members would begin to prepare the dead for the decedents, for their journey to the netherworld across the river Styx. So in their belief system, it wasn't like you just died and poof, you were on the other side. There was a journey that you had to make to actually get there. And the living had to help you out with this. They had to give you all the stuff you would need to be able to make this journey. So women chosen for the next of kin washed the deceased with warm water. And the warm water was symbolic, but the Greeks and the Romans did this. Everybody has their fail-safe for how you make sure somebody's not actually dead. Like everybody always has that fear of burying or cremating somebody while they're still alive. We won't have, the modern techniques until, the late 19th century. Late 19th century. I would say late 1900s, or I meant late 1800s, but we won't have these techniques. It was only getting started until the late 19th century. It's something that everybody had their little trick. How do you make sure somebody was actually dead? So they used warm water, and they felt that if there was any life left in the person, that would jar them out of it. They weren't trying to bring them back to life. They were just making sure they were actually dead. So a coin or an obol, that's one of those terms, you got to remember that, was placed in the decedent's mouth, and that was to pay the ferryman, Sharon, trip across the river Styx. The fares not paid, the decedent was doomed to wander 100 years on the shores. I guess after 100 years, Sharon would go, okay, fine, you get on the boat, I'll take you across. But 100 years is a long time to wait. So preparation of the dead. Here we go. Some females, again, their sacred duty of anointing the dead with oils, perfumes, and spices. There was no attempt to embalm. They just cleaned them up. And using a lot of these spices actually does cover up the scent of death. If you've ever seen this I saw this once for a Jewish funeral. And the sister of the decedent, she and her husband came in. He was a rabbi. He was a really interesting guy because he was a rabbi. His dad was a Baptist minister. They were an interesting family, but they came in and wash the body and put these spices on it. It actually did cover up the scent pretty good. I was surprised at it. There were 3 burial robes that were used. One was to cover the funeral bed itself, one was wrapped around the body, then one was an outer covering that went on everything. Wreaths made of woven flowers were created by relatives and friends for the deceased, and a honey cake was included. It was a drugged honey cake to be given to the dog Cerberus. He was a 3-headed devil dog that guarded the entrance to the afterlife. And what you would have to do is you'd have to take that drugged honey cake and you'd have to throw it, and then Cerberus would go and eat it, and then he would get woozy from the drugs, and you could sneak past. You would think if everybody did this, I think Cerberus would eventually pick up, but it sounds like he never did. So their mourning costumes and families, again, very dark stuff. Family and friends of the deceased wore dark, subdued colors. The deceased was robed in white. One day after death, the deceased was washed, anointed, dressed, and prepared for burial. The decedent would then be laid out in state, depending on their rank. This is for an important person. Friends and relatives would view the deceased, which in part served to guarantee that death had actually occurred. And we see this through the ancient world as well. People wanted to look that body over as well. They wanted to make sure that this person was not stabbed in the back or something. We see that a lot in the Middle Ages. Most scenes would be viewed for a day, but viewing could be extended up to 7 if the social status of the deceased warranted. I'm sure by day 7, the smells could not be so good because, again, Greece is a very warm weather area. Greece, rather, is a very warm weathered area. Right. Here we go. The funeral procession. So there's pictures of it in the book. Usually an hour before dawn, the procession formed to accompany the deceased to the tomb. The deceased would be placed on a bier, and in that term bier, that's still used today. That's like a wooden device with small wheels you put a casket on. I've heard it described as a coffee table with wheels. It always feels like you're going to tip over the casket if you're on like thick carpeting. If necessary, corpse bearers were hired. Some female mourners would also serve as hired dirge singers, and that term dirge right there. A dirge is a very sad funeral song. This is not like a hymn, which is uplifting. This is very sad. This is how low is the death and how awful is this death, and we wish it hadn't happened and all that stuff. Fraternity members would immediately proceed or follow the decedent. Men were welcome to join the procession, but to be a female and to be in this funeral procession, you either had to be over 16 years of age and in the family, or over 60. So any man could join you. Stranger, you're walking the street and join, and a man wants to join, you can. Females, you got to be either in the family and over 16, or if you're not in the family, you got to be over 60 to join. So again, that concept of cremation around 700. This is sort of where it took hold. The belief in the power of the flame to set the soul free and encourage its acceptance and preference. The cremated remains were believed to contain personal or spirit characteristics and were treated with reverence. So again, those cremated remains are still held as sacred. But at no time was earth burial completely abandoned by the Greeks. With the coffins, I'm just going to have to look into that. It's, the wood, stone, and baked clay coffins were used at various points. It's sort of is what it is there. Likewise with the tombs. Tombs often could be very decorative. When we look at the ancient Hebrews, they'll be the opposite. They'll be very, very plain. But with the Greeks, they're still relatively decorative. But this is all basic stuff, so I'm just going to read on your own. Perpetual care of ancient tombs. Family and friends to place practical and artistic ornaments, jewels, vessels, wreaths, and other items in the tomb and also the coffin. Many people would prepare for the perpetual care of their tomb by setting aside money for it throughout their life. Family tombs were also used, which were cared for by relatives. Again, if you're relatives, you're going to be buried there someday. Your ashes will be there someday, and it's in your best interest to take care of it. There's a really interesting display of these. If you go to the University of Pennsylvania, they have a museum of anthropology. No, I guess it's really, I guess it is generally anthropology, but they have a whole bunch of these on display there. It's really, really neat. I guess it's more of a museum of archaeology, now that I'm saying that, but it's semantics. They have a bunch of these, and they're really neat to look at, and also they have some mummies there, and they have one that's done in dry burial, which is, that was not somebody who was mummified, just put in the ground, and you can still see all the facial features. I mean, it's wild, really something else. And then the funeral feast. This is a topic that we will see quite frequently. It's not uncommon for people to fast after a death, and then after things would finish, you would have a large feast. And it just seems to be, those two things seem to go hand in hand throughout history, even today. How many times we've been in the cemetery or wherever, and people are inviting everyone back to their house or to a luncheon or whatever. There just seems to be something that goes hand in hand in this. And we'll see this throughout the Middle Ages. We'll see this with the early American experience, specifically up in Massachusetts, where the Puritans would really, go on a drinking bender for like 3 days after a funeral, which is really out of character for them. So it's interesting how they're always linked, the Romans. So let's pause here for a minute. Okay, so we're back. I moved the window up here because I find it distracting over here, but I jumped ahead. I hit a button and jumped ahead. One more forward. There we go. All right, Romans. Rome was probably the most influential of the societies in the ancient world. They were socially, culturally, administratively, politically, they were advances the world had never seen. It was the last republic until the United States. It was quite a jump in time. Ancient and medieval, and even people in the Renaissance and even later periods still felt that they had not passed the Romans. Rome was the great, the greatest political force that the political entity, I should say, that the world had ever seen. Nobody had ever seen a nation like that. Their building practices, their libraries, their road systems. They built, the Colosseum. If you look at that, they used to fill that thing up with water and have like ship battles and something, all wild stuff. The aqueducts. I mean, people up until like the 1800s, so probably 1700s, well, probably early 1800s, still felt that they were, standing on the shoulders of giants. That was always referring to Rome. Like, we're doing this, but Rome did this. It really wasn't until the industrial era, and really the British industrial era, that mankind felt that they had surpassed the Romans. I mean, that's a long time from the fall of Rome, to still feel that somebody had come before you and that was more advanced than you were. We're living in a time where we are the most advanced humans that have ever been, but there were thousands of years where people knew that, okay, this civilization was much more advanced than we are. We just can't catch up to them. So yeah, it's really until the Victorian era that the mankind still felt that we were behind the Romans in some way. Rome is also the only other time in history that we see funeral directors similar to us. They are a secular lay professional. They offer both services and merchandise, and it's very interesting. Just for a small period of time that they existed, but it's interesting to look at. So the Romans made a contribution, blah, 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 blah. The cities, they are also responsible for merging the role of secular undertaker in the area of practice of expressive arts. The Romans borrowed concepts from the Greeks and adapted them to suit their needs. So Rome became such a large empire because it goes from being a republic to then being an empire. Very Star Wars-esque, right? As they got larger, they brought in all these other influences, and they sort of became part of that Roman experience. So they're destinies. The Romans had this very animistic view, and animism is found in a lot of different cultures. It's often found in like hunter-gatherer tribes, things like that. And animism is the general belief that everything has a soul. Like, I have a soul, you have a soul. This bottle has a soul. A lake has a soul. All animals have souls. Pencil or pen that has a soul, right? So everything has a soul. And when death occurs, that soul has a tendency to just hover around, either the place of death or the place of burial. And this can kind of be problematic. This can ultimately, it can be a pain in the ass because you don't properly appease that soul. If you don't show that you are sufficiently upset and distraught by the loss of that person, it's going to come back to haunt you. And so that impacts their death practices. The soul required constant attention, and so the bereaved would make offerings of food and drink to appease it. If these offerings were discontinued, the soul would cease to be happy and might even become a spirit of evil that would bring harm to the bereaved. So yeah, it was a problem. It does have an impact on the way they handle things, though. We'll see as we go along. From 300 BC, that's around about the time that we're talking about. As that empire was growing, again, more and more groups are being brought into this, and they brought in a bunch of mystery cults with them. And if you remember, with the just a few minutes ago, we were talking about the cult of Dionysus. Well, not all of them viewed death the same way. Many of them saw a very joyous afterlife. There's the cult of Isis, cult of Osiris, there's a cult of Dionysus, there's a number of other ones. But during this time, the Romans began to change their religious and philosophical beliefs concerning death and the afterlife. This transpired as a result of their contact with the ancient Greeks, as well as civilizations in the Oriental East. The Romans embraced a new belief in mystery cults, which represented the religious and philosophical beliefs of the ancient Greeks and those in the Oriental East. This belief emphasized the spiritual aspects of the afterlife, the hope of joining with the cult god in pleasant and wonderful eternity, excuse me. So they also believe that those who did not enter this euphoric eternity would spend eternity in a world of torment, gloom, and continued unhappiness. So again, it's very much a sort of a heaven versus hell thing. So they've got, like I said, all of these influences happening at once. At the same time, you also had the Epicureans, and the Epicureans were similar like the Greek atomists. They believed they really didn't have a fear or a joy in death. They thought death, your afterlife would be the same thing as your before life. Right? Like, so all those centuries that you were not alive, it's not as if things were bad for you. You just didn't exist yet, and that's sort of the way that they viewed it. It was sort of this very much this, let us eat and drink because tomorrow we shall die. So around 300 AD, this is also when we see Christianity sort of evolving and popping up. It's not fully there yet. St. Augustine is closer to 400 BC or 400 AD, excuse me, and it's much. He does a lot to evolve that belief system, the idea of the Trinity, or the three people versus one, and there were wars fought over this. So the emergence of Christianity as the dominant religion in the Roman Empire brought a theological view and perspective of death. Christians had an organized set of beliefs about mankind and the Maker. Death customs were patterned after the mode of sepulture that was used for Jesus Christ. Roman catacombs are pictured below. So well underway. It's not the dominant religion yet, but it brings that theological orientation to death. You have a mode of disposition as laid out in the Bible. Well, what are you supposed to do in life? Oh, you're supposed to try and be like Jesus. You're supposed to try and be good and all that stuff. Well, what are supposed to do in death? Well, what do they do with Jesus? Oh, here's what they did. As it prevailed, it brings, as Christianity ultimately does become the state religion, but it brings a general belief in an afterlife and a pleasant afterlife to Rome in general. And when we talk about the Christians later on, the Christians were the ones who first brought in this idea of rest in peace, and that didn't exist in a lot of older religions. It didn't exist for everybody, that's for sure. So Roman practiced both cremation and burial. With the rise of Christianity, burial became more popular as it mimicked the burial of Christ and reinforced the belief in the holy nature of the body. They felt that the body is a holy vessel, and to destroy it would be a sin. And this changes through time. I don't think it's a hell where they trespass at this time, but it's one of the situations where, if possible, you should take care of it. You should bury it. Oriental Muslim culture or the practice of cremation, which also influenced the rise of burial as a means of interment. Burial took place outside of the city for sanitation reasons. When you look at any given group, their death habits, their death practices will reflect their culture. What's important to you in life will be reflected in the way that you handle your dead. And to the Romans, what was important was Rome. Rome was the eternal city, the city on the hill, all that good stuff, right? And you don't want a bunch of bodies strewn about it, and you should not mix the land of the living with the land of the dead. All burials would be done outside the city walls. They believed in what they called extramural. Let me spell this out for you. Let me share. Whiteboard, text, extramural burials. I can actually do one word, extramural burials. And that just means outside of the city walls, right? That's all that means, is outside of the walls. Extramural just means if you ever played intramural sports or intramural activities in high school, that means something inside the walls of the school. But again, you don't want the land, you don't want to mix the land of the living and the land of the dead. They should be separate things. Dead bodies bring with them insects and smells and rats and disease and plague. Like, you don't want it around your Roman citizens. So during this time, if somebody was just poor and had nothing, and a slave, or somebody was just completely flat broke, and indigent, that was the word I was trying to think of, that was sitting right in front of me. They would be put in the common sepulchrum, right? That is the common burial pit, again, located outside of the city. Burial societies, and again, this was done not to be like a jerk to them, like, oh, you're such an awful person, you go to the common sepulchrum. It was done just to get the bodies out of Rome. Again, you can't have some dead guy lying on the street. It's not good for Rome in general, so they would just take them out. During this time, we started seeing burial societies being formed. And this is from like the artisan or middle class of Rome. They began sort of pulling their resources and creating these charities, essentially, so that they could see to these burials, and people didn't want to end up in the common sepulchrum, and they would sort of do this so that they could give them a decent burial. Ultimately, this becomes a municipal concern. That's the way these groups sort of viewed it. This the same thing as offering a library or roads or anything else that Rome offered. We should be doing this for our dead. So preparation of the dead When a death happened, it tended to be in the presence of the family. It wasn't something that hid sort of the way that we do in nursing homes today. Like when you go into a nursing home, a body, and then somebody runs for it, they close all the doors that you don't see, bringing the stretcher through or something. It was more out in the open. That normally happened in plain sight, with the family present. See them again be washed with warm water. Again, that test for death to make sure that they're actually dead. They would be dressed. They would be washed with warm water, anointed, and laid out in a toga. Put on a funeral couch. The insignia and rank they had achieved in life would be placed on them. The seating was placed on a funeral couch with their feet pointing towards the door, and we'll talk about when they moved them in just a bit. Most would lay in state for 3 to 7 days, depending on their station in life. During this time, they would burn incense and lay flowers sort of cover up the smell. This is important. They would put a cypress and a bow, cypress and pine bows on the door. And this was done as a warning to passersby. And it wasn't like, oh no, but it was like, look, if you're coming into this house, we have death in this house. It was just like a heads up. It's them again looking out for other Roman citizens. If you're elderly, if you're sick already, you may not want to come in here. So it was, again, protecting people from, they put it very good here, the pollution of death. The flowers and incense help mask the odor because, again, the remains were not embalmed the way that they are today. Occasionally, there would be if somebody was very, very important, they would do cavity treatment, but that was very rare. And when they say cavity treatment, what they're talking about is a visceral embalming, not sort of cavity treatment the way we do it today. That's talking about removing all of the organs from the central cavity, and then that way it's going to slow down that decomposition. Postmortem care of the wealthy. Professional undertakers were employed to care for the wealthy. So if somebody was very well to do, you would call one of these people. The embalming that was done was simply an anointing with precious fragrant oils, spices, and perfumes were also employed in an effort to delay putrefaction so that the decedent could lay in state. The Romans were not concerned about preserving their remains for eternity. As we discussed with Egyptians, occasionally, like I said before, cavity embalming would be done for the wealthy. It was very rare, but like I said, the wealthy were able to use this ancient funeral director. The layout, the hierarchy of any given undertaking business was laid out like this. And there was 4 tiers to it. The Libertinarius was the highest. The head undertaker as a direct ancestor. This is not true. This is okay. The Libertinarius was the head undertaker and it's the direct ancestor of the modern funeral director. That's not true. There are similarities there, but it's not as if when the funeral industry started in the 1900s here, a bunch of undertakers popped out history books and what did Rome do? They didn't even know they existed. It just happened organically. His most important function was to arrange the details of the funeral procession. Funeral procession is very important, which is of great importance to Roman culture. He hired mourners, mourning costumes, and funeral accessories, and would arrange services for the bereaved. So again, it's very similar to a funeral director. It's very similar to an arranger. You sit down, you work out all the details, the logistics. How are we doing this thing? When are we doing this thing? Where are we doing this thing? And what's involved, and the time, all that stuff, all the wonderful details of any given service. And that's what this the guy was doing, Libertinarius. And somebody once said that they remembered this, because you have to remember all 4 of them. They remember this, that funeral directors are always lying about their numbers. So when you see the one that starts with like LI, okay, there you go. Pollingters were embalmers and were either slaves or lower employees of the Libertinarius. They were the low-ranking people. Again, I always remind interns, it's sort of the situation you're in, until you get licensed. The designator was the master of ceremonies, and the director of the funeral procession. Again, very important stuff. He emceed everything, and the funeral procession is very, very important to this entire event. His job was to assist the Libertinarius in arranging the details of the funeral. And then on the day of the service, he actually emceed everything. And then the praetor was the crier summoned participants to the funeral. This is sort of the guy you stick on the corner. He goes, here you come to the services of Maximilian Maximus. I'm not really good at thinking up Roman names. But he would announce the services. And remember all 4 of these will absolutely pop up again. So the Roman funeralis, this is the funeral procession. And the term funeralis just means a torchlit procession, but it's where we get our term for funeral. This is the central point. This is the most important part of their services. Because again, what's important to this culture? Well, Rome is important to this culture. Well, why shouldn't we show what a great Roman this person is? The ritual gave the wealthy and important people an opportunity to display their social status and economic status. Funerals for ordinary people were held at nighttime, but if you were influential, they were held during the day, but they would still have the torches. And again, that torchlit procession, because funerals, burials at least, were initially done at night, and that just, they continued that ceremony. Torchbearers were in attendance even during the daytime. Funerals is a reminder of the custom of the nocturnal burial. So the procession ended up outside the city. Again, remember, they don't bury inside the city, outside the city where cremation or burial took place. But they didn't go directly there. They would take a circuitous route, sort of like, here's point A and point B. You don't go that way. You go wind all around, you go all over the place. And this is done for two things. Number one, it's done to celebrate the person. During this torchlit procession, they would have actors portraying the deceased, because they would take a death mask of him and they'd pull out all the death masks of his ancestors. So they'd have actors portraying him going into the afterlife and his ancestors welcoming him in. You'd have people playing music. They'd have professional mourners. They always describe the Romans as sort of stiff upper lip type, but you had to properly mourn. Again, you had to show that soul that you were properly upset, or else they may come haunt you. So they did all this stuff. So they had all these professional mourners around the deceased, screeching and crying the whole time, calling out his name. And the second reason this is done was to confuse the spirit. If you remember when we talked about when the person was laying in the house, their feet were towards the door. When they took them out, they always took them feet first. And this is why today it's believed at least, that why we still carry people feet first. It goes back to this idea that, if you're going feet first, you cannot look back to see, like, where are we going? So it confuses the person. And again, if you're going all over the place, you would think they would know where they lived. But in any sense, it confuses the spirit. And in that way, if you screw something up, you don't properly mourn them, that spirit cannot find his way back to you. It's interesting stuff. The ceremony included the consecration of the burial site, as well as the purification of those who were in attendance. Earth was cast upon the remains. If you were around death, there was sort of felt that you needed to be purified to sort of get that. I don't know how I want to describe that sort of filthiness that comes with death off of you. The mourning period. During the mourning period, offerings were made to the gods. Memorial festivals were held to remember the dead. And again, remember, you have to properly mourn them. Professional mourners were employed to appease the dead. The Romans were very stoic. Again, so it was very stiff upper lip. So why should we do this? Let's get somebody else to do it. So these professional mourners would come in. They were women who would shriek and beat their breasts. They would shriek and beat their breasts. They'd pull their hair out, and all of this would work up to a crescendo. And at sort of the peak of it, what they would do is they would circle the coffin, or however the deceased was laid out, 3 times while calling out his name, and again shrieking, like cutting their face with their nails and pulling hair out, and they would call out his name 3 times when they were doing this. So three times they would circle and scream out his name and scratch themselves, and once that was done, they felt that they had properly appeased that spirit, and hopefully they wouldn't come back to haunt you. So Constantine the Great. He is the first Christian emperor, and he's going into a great battle. I forget who he was battling, and he claims to have had a dream where an angel comes to him. I believe it's Angel Gabriel, but it's been a while since I've read about Constantine. And so this angel comes to him and he says, well, if you convert to Christianity, I will, help. I will let you win this battle, and we'll support you, and then you can become, the great emperor of Rome. And so Constantine agrees, and he goes and he paints on all the shields. Whiteboard, drawing. He paints this symbol. It's Chi-Rho, which I'm not very good at drawing. It's basically a P with an X going through it. You get the idea. And thus starts Christian Rome. And you don't have to remember about the Chi-Rho, it's sort of called Chi-Rho, but it's just in the idea that Constantine is the one that changes all of this. Like, they had a pretty good system going on. We've got undertakers, it's all as well. Like, we've got a business blossoming, and the business model, at least. He comes along, changes everything. He takes hold of funerals. He says that should be handled by the state. That's something we should do. So they had teams of people. He said every person was to receive a coffin without payment, and a procession that leads to the grave, the crossbearer, 8 monks, and 3 acolytes. Teams were trained, prepared to do this. He made it illegal to sell expensive funeral merchandise and basically took full control of funerals. Ultimately, after Rome falls apart, funerals will fall under the control of the church. It's really families handling it with the church's help. And it stays like that really until the 19th century, until the 1800s, the middle to the later part of the 1800s, when we start to see funeral directors and really undertakers in those days developing, and that's when we actually take it back. Edict of Toleration is basically what allowed this to happen. Christianity, and when we talk about the ancient Christians, we'll talk about this a little bit more. But for the first 300 years of their existence, they were underground. They were in the catacombs. All of their life was all of their spiritual life was underground, and all of it was in their burial places, because that's where they buried their dead, in the catacombs. So it ends up linking both spiritual life and spiritual death together. And ultimately, Constantine will change that ruling on extramural burials. He goes, no, we should all be buried as close to the church as possible, which will cause issues later on, especially when we get to times like the Great Plagues and things like that. It really becomes an issue at that point. But this Edict of Toleration was what allowed, number one, Christianity to flourish, but number two, basically, because of Constantine in general, put the kibosh on this early attempt at funeral directing. Right, and that should be a wrap. Any questions or anything like that, feel free to shoot me an email or bring it up in class.